Welcome, American Political Thought students, to my video on the Tuesday, the 21st of April. Some announcements first. Today we're going to look at the American political thought concerning what Americans think America's role is in the world. Next class, I'm going to do a review of the semester. All right, so that'll be on the 23rd. Now, the deans have sent me another piece of information about the final exam. And they say that a take-home final must be during the exam period, and it can't be due before May 12th. So here's the scoop. On May 4th, the beginning of final exam period, I'm going to mail out the take-home final exam for American Political Thought, and it'll be due by midnight on May 12th. So we'll comply with what the deans think would be a fair way to do our exams. You still have other things due for me. Your last periodical critique and your book critique. They're due this Thursday, the 23rd at midnight, right? So that'll keep you off the streets. You can be busy on that sort of thing. Now let's get to today's topic. Today's topic is what do Americans think in terms of politics as to America's role in the world? And you know what? It depends on when you ask Americans what America's role in the world is. They've changed over time. You'll get one answer if you asked Americans at the time George Washington was in his prime. You'd get quite a different answer on December 8th, 1941, just after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Americans really changed their minds on America's role in the world. So let's get started and let's look historically at what Americans have thought about America's role in the world. The great dividing period for this idea would be 1898. In 1898, think of what happened in the United States. The United States had a war with what was a declining great power, Spain at the time. And the 1890s also represent a big change in America as a country. Before the 1890s, America was primarily an agricultural country. From the 1890s on, America's becoming more and more an industrialized power and one of the great powers in the world. Matter of fact, I have a chart for you put together from data taken from economic historians. And what it shows is the percentage of America's GDP that is produced, the solid line is by agriculture, and the dotted line is by non-agricultural sources. So what we see here is back in 1776, the non-agricultural part of America's economy is rather small. Most of America's economy is coming from agriculture. But as we move on from the Revolutionary War period, we see the agricultural percentage of the GDP drop and the non-agriculture rise. And those lines cross in the 1890s. That's a transition time in the United States. After the 1890s, America is going to be predominantly an industrial power. Before the 1890s, predominantly an agricultural power, and that makes a big change in America's idea as its role in the world. Before the 1890s, the United States was seen as a secondary power, not one of the great powers like Britain or France or Spain. That begins to change with the Spanish-American War in 1898. We'll go into more of the details, but a person who was really instigating war with Spain in 1898 was Teddy Roosevelt, and he represents a big transition from the earlier idea of America's role in the world to what would come later. Now, let's look at the earlier tradition that Teddy Roosevelt was fighting against. This is America when it's a secondary power before 1898. Think of under the Articles of Confederation. The United States did not have a proactive kind of foreign policy. It had a small government without much power, and the United States was not a very powerful country at the time. Under the Treaty of Paris, ending the Revolutionary War, Britain was supposed to vacate some forts, do certain things, and the United States didn't really have the military power to make Britain do that sort of thing. Under the Constitution, the United States' central government, its federal government, got more power, and so it could begin to conduct a foreign policy at that point. But under the Articles of Confederation, there wasn't much of a foreign policy here in the United States. And as it emerged under the Constitution, America had a basic idea of what it had to do in foreign policy, and that is it realized it was a weak country, that there were great powers across the Atlantic, and what it tried to do was protect its liberty and protect its sovereignty. And it used several mechanisms. The United States used several mechanisms to try to protect the liberty of the United States and the freedom of this country. One of the first ones is it it had a policy of unilateral neutralism, meaning unilateral, we're not going to join other countries in alliances, and neutralism. Neutralism is the idea we're not going to take sides in the fights that take place among the great powers. The area where we can really look for some inspiration on unilateral neutralism was in George Washington's farewell address, his famous farewell address, probably written by Alexander Hamilton, but Washington wouldn't mouth things if he didn't believe them in his farewell address. And the famous phrase in Washington's farewell address was that the U.S. must steer clear of entangling alliances with the great powers. That is, we can't be involved in the great power struggle by allying ourselves with one of the great powers, because then the other great powers would come after us. And since the United States is a secondary power, this was seen as a way to threaten the sovereignty and the freedom of the United States. Now, sometimes that period and that idea is called isolationism. That's a pejorative. I'd rather not use that term because the United States didn't isolate itself after George Washington's farewell address. We traded with the world. We had a lot to do with the world. We took many immigrants from different parts of the world. So the United States was involved in the world, but it didn't want to get involved in the great power kind of struggles. That was the idea. So I object to using the word isolationism to describe the United States in that period. Now, we could use this period of and this principle of unilateral neutralism during this period, as long as the United States had a tolerable relationship with what was the great imperialistic power of the time, Great Britain. Great Britain had the power to threaten America's sovereignty and its freedom. So as long as we had a good relationship with Great Britain, we could stay neutral and we could not form alliances. To the extent that we would get a negative relationship with Britain and feel threatened, we'd have to cozy up to other powers like Spain and like France at the time. But we could remain neutral as long as we had a decent relationship with Great Britain. The second principle that Americans used to keep our sovereignty intact and to protect our freedom was something that we'd call the Monroe Doctrine, that's been associated with President Monroe. And the idea was this, that here in the Americas, we would work hard to not let one of the great powers have a power base in the Americas that could threaten American sovereignty. That was the Monroe Doctrine. And we pretty well followed the Monroe Doctrine. We were leery of the great powers having power bases here. We didn't like that Napoleon looked to the Americas for power. What is now Haiti was not Saint-Dominique at that time. And Napoleon had sent an army there and tried its best to build up a base that America's opposed. It didn't work out. Haiti at the time was a source of great money for the French, because they had slave labor and they had crops, especially sugar, that they could make a fortune off of. And the Napoleonic Wars could very well be financed by a big chunk of money from Saint-Dominique. It didn't work out. It turned out that you brought slaves from Africa to work in the Caribbean in this really tropical climate. And what they brought with them was the disease yellow fever. And Europeans had not been exposed to yellow fever, so they had no immunity. Most of the French imperialists and many of Napoleon's army caught yellow fever and died. And so it was a very negative kind of kind of mission that Napoleon tried to set up a power base in the Caribbean. It never worked out, and Napoleon really withdrew French power from the Caribbean, and then it owned a big chunk of territory that it saw it probably couldn't hold on to it. So why don't you get some money out of President Jefferson? The Louisiana Purchase was the way for the French to really move outside of North America at the time, and for America to beef up its sovereignty. So that Monroe Doctrine was followed. A great exception to the Monroe Doctrine, I would say, was after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the United States had a secret deal with the Soviet Union. If it withdrew its atomic missiles and its weapons from Cuba, it would allow the Cuba to have a relationship with the Soviet Union, and for the Soviet Union really to have a power base at a lower level here in North America. Cuba's been a thorn in the side of the United States ever since that exception to the Monroe Doctrine of 1962. Now, how did the United States do under this unilateral neutralism and for about that century after George Washington? First of all, Americans had an expansionist kind of ideas, and what it did is that America moved from the East Coast all the way across North America. So it didn't get involved in wars in the distant abroad, but close abroad, and joined the United States to make the United States a very large country at the time. Uh, this idea called manifest destiny, that it was manifest that this small little country was going to grow all the way to the Atlantic, all the way to the Pacific from the Atlantic. That took place, and that was much of the expansionist activity of Americans in the 19th century. But America could have its sovereignty not checked and be confident. By the middle of the 19th century, Abraham Lincoln could rightly claim that all the armies of the great powers in Europe, France and Great Britain, they could not take a drink from the Ohio River, nor could they make their footprints on the snows of the Appalachian Mountains, because we could defend ourselves, and they had those long supply trains, and they really couldn't mount an military expeditionary force in the United States. So our sovereignty by the mid-19th century was pretty well something we could be confident of. Now, we made a transition away from this unilateral neutralism of George Washington in the 1890s that I had mentioned. The war with Spain was one of our first expansionist kind of crusades outside the North America proper. And what happened in that war is that we picked a fight really with Spain, and we knocked them out of the Caribbean and knocked them out of the Philippines. And a person that was very important in having this war with Spain be initiated was Teddy Roosevelt. Now, he wasn't the president. He was serving in Washington. I think he was the Secretary of the Navy at the time. And he tried his best to gin up a war with Spain because Teddy Roosevelt represented a direct challenge to Washington's idea of not having entangling alliances and being unilateral and neutralist, because Teddy Roosevelt felt that the United States was this great power with great principles and it should expand beyond the United States. So it was Teddy Roosevelt that used American power to build the Panama Canal and grab a part of the isthmus here in North America. And he represented that big change. Since that time, that really represents the first time America really becomes a crusader state. That is, it actually thinks we have these great American principles of democracy here in this country. We now have, by the 1890s, we're becoming an industrial power, and we could flex military muscle, and now we can throw off that unilateral neutralism and move into the world as in crusades. And that's the way that Roosevelt was and Wilson was. And so President Wilson we associate with an expansionist foreign policy, with not staying at home. Nothing like that quote-unquote isolationism for President Wilson. And the tradition of Wilson is the tradition of progressivism, that we should expand government based upon moral principles and make the world a better place. So it was President Wilson that got involved in World War I to do that sort of thing, and it was his vision that we could throw off this unilateral neutralism and join the United Nations. The United Nations was the project for Wilson to do that sort of thing, in which the United States would become international in its orientation towards the world. Now, Wilson was not successful at that. He wanted the United States to become international and be a very active member of the United Nations. Opposed to him were the kind of conservatives who thought, no, we shouldn't abandon unilateral neutralism. When you join an international organization like the United States, it makes great decisions that we don't get to make on our own, like war and peace, so that you're giving up some of your sovereignty when you pass it off into international organizations like that. So they felt the concrete implications of Wilsonianism was that we would give up sovereignty, and so there began after World War I a kind of fight between people who were traditionalists, who did not want to abandon George Washington's idea. We only take care of America's problems, and we don't get involved in these international fights. This was the struggle in the 1920s and the 1930s for the United States as to what should be its principles, as to how it's going to exist in the world, and what should be its role in the world. This 2-decade-long struggle in the United States for our thinking on this ended on December 7th, 1941, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, at which that kind of what was thought and called an isolationism was kind of pushed off to the side, and the United States jumped into internationalism in World War II. And at the end of World War II, you could see the extent to which Americans' ideas changed, because in World War I, we wouldn't join the United Nations. But now at the end of World War II, such a horrible war, it dawned on Americans that they just couldn't sit behind these two oceans. We had to be involved in the world because the world was interested in what happened all over the great powers of the world. So the United Nations, which would be the Second World War's answer to internationalism, was embraced by the United States. The treaty founding the United Nations was the treaty in San Francisco, put together here in the United States, and the headquarters for the United Nations would be in Manhattan, in New York City. What a big change that is from the unilateral neutralism before. The unilateral neutralist forces have been completely routed. There was a thought they might come back when Eisenhower, after World War II, a Republican, and the Republican Party is where there was this opposition to internationalism and getting involved in international organizations. When Eisenhower declared himself a Republican and ran and won the presidency, people wondered, is there going to be some backstepping? But Eisenhower would have none of that. He was an internationalist, and now internationalism had won the day in the United States, especially among our elites. So what we had afterwards, after World War II, was the United States going all out into globalization and internationalization. The thought that the United Nations could represent peace through multilateral work was really shattered when the Cold War broke out and the Soviet Union and the United States' their coalition during World War II broke down, and now they did nothing but use the UN to fight. And we had fights in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, which represented the United States being multilaterally involved in the world. And pretty well, U.S. foreign policy was based on the idea we tried to contain communism in the Soviet Union. Throughout my lifetime, the threat of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet leaders were unmistakably candid about trying to destroy the American Republic, and they had the means to do it. So this kind of containment, which brought together the different forces in the United States through a multilateral effort, at which it was seen that containment could only be successful if the United States joined what Washington would call entangling alliances like NATO, SEATO, ANZUS. We had defense treaties, and we still have them with Korea and Japan, based upon that thinking at the time, the thinking of 1945, and the consensus that the United States has to be a leader in the world in keeping world peace. Uh, that was all well and dandy until we get into the 1980s. And now the Soviet Union, to the surprise of almost everybody, began to look like it would topple. I remember the ambassador to the United States was Dobrynin, and he said, as we got into the the 1980s, that in fact we're really going to strike a blow against the United States. He told foreign policy elites here, we're going to disappear and deprive you of an enemy, and deprive you of the fundamental ideas that bring Americans together as to what Americans should do in the world. And in a sense, that really did happen. After the fall of the Soviet Union, we continue to have elites that we have right now that really think the principles of 1945 should not be abandoned, that the United States should be heavily engaged in the world and in globalization, in trade, this kind of neoliberalism that's taken root since the 1980s, that international businesses and international trade, the movement of goods and capital across borders and international trade through globalization. This is how we should conduct our place in the world, and also through military force, in which the United States has its allies in Europe and in Asia, and those alliances are what keep the peace in the United States. I would say the last 10 years there's been some challenge to that. It was the internationalists who really got us involved in the wars of the Middle East, in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that they've not gone well, and so there's been some opening to kind of challenge the 1945 consensus. I think it's going on now, and I expect that we'll have a fight about exactly what will America's role be in the world. I think the triumph of Donald Trump as president has really brought that to the fore. The idea that maybe we just shouldn't let the elites conduct foreign policy, that in fact the U.S. military alliances cost the United States a lot of money, and the United States can't even afford to pay its bills now. And should it continue to pull the wagon in which European powers' defense will depend upon the U.S. Treasury? I mean, the argument is that in fact, European countries have a greater GDP and they have a greater population. Shouldn't they pull the wagon of their own defense and the United States not be responsible for their own defense? After all, the Soviet Union has really disappeared. Same thing with Korea. Korea is not the poor country it was in 1945. It has a greater GDP, much greater GDP, and bigger population than North Korea. Can it foot the bill for its own defense? I just saw the president the other day at his COVID news conference saying, "We're getting the Koreans to pay more for their defense. They ponied up $1 billion, and we don't think that's enough. We're coming back. We think South Korea should pay for more of its defense." The same way with Japan. Japan is a rich country now. Can it afford to defend itself? These are the kind of issues that I expect there to be a fight about. In general, I think much of foreign policy has been left to elites that specialize. Elites in the Department of Defense, the State Department, the universities and the think tanks, people that specialize in this sort of thing. And the general consensus is not to abandon the multilateral kind of internationalism that was 1945, had set the United States foreign policy on the foundation it has now. If these elites have to argue this with mass Americans, I think there are plenty of mass Americans that would want to back off of that kind of role for the United States and have less of a role in the United States. For instance, I don't think elites would get away with marching the army into another Middle East country in a war, say with someone like Iran, I think the switchboards would light up in Congress, that Americans don't want to get involved with that. So I think we're at a kind of crossroads now where there's a kind of fight as to what's the future going to be for the United States, in which it's not this great superpower, in which it's one of the great powers. And will it continue to shoulder that burden that it has in the past? It's probably your generation that's going to make that kind of decision as to what's going to happen. Now I'm going to set up, I'm going to upload, this is uploaded now if you're seeing it, to YouTube, and I'm going to set up a board on our discussion board at which you can put your comments on this. And I'd like to know what you think about where America's going to move in its role in the world. Thank you.